What historical fact have you learned about that has shattered all your ideas about life? Answer 1. When I learned about the history of the Tuskegee medical experiments, it completely changed my perception of the world. It's about how, from 1932 to 1972, the U.S. government experimented on African American men with syphilis, promising them free treatment but not actually providing it. Instead, the researchers simply watched them develop the disease, even when effective treatments such as penicillin already existed. The men in the study died and passed the disease on to their wives and children, all for the sake of science. I grew up believing in the idea of fairness and that the government takes care of its citizens. But this discovery made me realize that there are many examples of systematic abuse of power that we are not even taught about in school. This incident showed me how far inhumanity can go in the name of progress and left a deep imprint on my perception of society and trust in government institutions. Answer 2. What was shocking to me was the fact that many of the works of art we value today were created as a result of colonialism and plunder. I learned about this when I was studying the history of the Louvre. The museum that I thought was a symbol of culture and heritage turned out to be home to thousands of artifacts stolen from countries in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. These works of art, representing the cultural heritage of peoples, were taken away without their consent and are now on public display in a country that has nothing to do with them. This story made me reconsider my views on art and culture. I began to wonder, what right do we have to these objects? Why haven't they been returned to their rightful owners? My ideas about culture and museums have completely changed, and now I look at many things differently, wondering at what price they were acquired. Answer 3. The history of the Holodomor in Ukraine is a fact that changed my worldview. I learned about it relatively recently, although it happened only a few generations ago. Millions of people died from famine artificially caused by Stalin's policies in 1932 to 1933. I had always thought that mass starvation occurred due to natural disasters or economic hardship, but to learn that it was a planned genocide aimed at destroying an entire people shocked me to the core. At first, I couldn't believe that this was possible in the modern world. It would seem that in the 20th century, humanity should have already drawn conclusions from previous tragedies, but this story reminded me how fragile life is and how easily authorities can manipulate the destinies of millions of people. I began to value freedom of speech and democracy more, realizing that without them such horrors could happen again. Answer 4. A fact that struck me to the core concerns the fashion industry. I learned that many famous brands use child labor in developing countries to produce their clothing. The most shocking thing for me was the Nike case in the 90s, when it turned out that children worked in factories for 12, 16 hours a day, earning pennies in conditions that can hardly be called human. I've always believed that large corporations adhere to certain ethical standards, but this discovery showed me the dark side of globalization. As consumers, we rarely think about the journey a product has taken to reach our shelves. This fact made me realize that sometimes beautiful things hide terrible stories of exploitation and injustice. Since then, I have become more interested in where and how the products I buy are made. Answer 5. The story that killed everything I thought about life was the Opium Wars between Great Britain and China in the 19th century. I knew that wars are often fought over resources, but to learn that Britain started 2 wars just to force China to buy opium was a real shock to me. This was not just military intervention. It was a cynical strategy to destroy an entire people for financial gain. This fact showed me how unprincipled powerful countries can be when it comes to controlling resources and markets. My ideas about civilized nations, which supposedly always strive for progress and humanism, were destroyed. It made me think differently about international politics and how decisions are made that affect the lives of millions of people. Answer 6. I always believed that scientific discoveries and medical progress lead only to the best, until I learned about the history of euthanasia in Nazi Germany. The T4 program provided for the systematic killing of people with physical and mental disabilities. They were considered unworthy of life, and doctors who were supposed to treat people became executioners, destroying thousands of lives for the sake of the purity of the nation. This story shocked me. I could not imagine that in a country that was proud of its achievements in science and medicine, such horrors could be legalized. This made me doubt that science and progress automatically lead to humanism. Without ethics and moral leadership, even the greatest achievements can turn into disasters. Answer 7. It was a shock to me that women in Switzerland only gained the right to vote in 1971. Until that moment, I perceived Switzerland as a symbol of progress, democracy, and neutrality, a country where human rights were always respected. But to learn that in one of the most developed countries in the world, women did not have the right to vote until the 70s was a shock to me. It made me rethink how slow progress on women's rights can be, even in countries considered advanced. This fact reminded me that the rights we now take for granted were hard-won, and that even the most advanced societies can suffer from deep structural injustices. Answer 8. When I learned about Mao Zedong's Long March, it changed my perception of revolutions. On the one hand, this march, when communists in China crossed thousands of kilometers to escape persecution, was always presented as a heroic act. But then I learned at what terrible cost it was achieved. Thousands of people died from hunger, disease, and fighting, and often it was not about heroism, but about the brutal necessity of survival. This fact destroyed my ideas that revolutions are always driven by high ideals, and sacrifices are justified for the sake of a great goal. It became clear to me that behind every revolution there are not only ideals, but also colossal suffering of people, whose names and destinies are often forgotten in the light of great historical events. Answer 9. It was a huge shock for me to learn about the history of the Red Terror in Soviet Russia after the 1917 revolution. I always believed that the revolution led to the liberation of the people from the oppression of Tsarism, but the fact that thousands of people were shot without trial simply for belonging to the bourgeoisie or for suspicion changed my perception. This fact made me think about how quickly and easily the ideals of freedom and equality can turn into terror and violence. I realized that revolutions do not always lead to justice, and sometimes they lead to new forms of oppression and violence, often more brutal than previous ones. Answer 10. The story of Japanese comfort women during World War II shook me to the core. These women, many of whom were from Korea and China, were forced into sexual slavery for Japanese soldiers. I was amazed that this terrible fact was kept quiet for so long and only recently began to receive due attention. This fact made me realize how many historical traumas remain unresolved and how many people continue to suffer even after the end of the war. I learned that history is not always fair and that much suffering remains unknown until someone dares to speak up and tell their truth. Answer 11. One of the facts that killed my ideas about life was the history of American internment camps for the Japanese during World War II. I was shocked that in a country that proclaimed freedom and equality, more than 100,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly displaced and incarcerated in camps simply because of their ethnicity. This story made me think about how easily fear and bias can lead to human rights violations, even in the freest countries. I began to understand more how fragile our civil liberties are and how important it is to protect them, especially in difficult times. Answer 12. A fact that deeply struck me was connected with the history of the concentration camp on the island of Gori in Senegal. This island was one of the key transit points for slaves from Africa to America, and thousands of people died there in terrible conditions. I knew about the slave trade, but the scale of cruelty and systematic destruction of people for profit completely destroyed my understanding of human nature. This story made me rethink our past and realize that many of the economic successes of Western countries were achieved at the cost of unimaginable suffering for millions of people. This fact made me realize how important it is to remember and acknowledge the dark pages of history in order to never repeat such mistakes. Answer 13. When I learned about the Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire, it was like a bolt from the blue. I never heard about this in school, and the fact that more than 1 million Armenians were killed in the early 20th century made me wonder how many more similar horrors are hidden from us. I was shocked that so many countries still refuse to recognize this genocide, which means that the suffering of the victims continues to be ignored. It opened my eyes to how political interests can influence our perception of history. I learned that history is often written by the winners, and that it is important to seek the truth, even if it is inconvenient or contrary to the accepted narrative. Answer 14. The story of the Ides of March in ancient Rome, when Julius Caesar was assassinated by his own senators, shocked me. I always perceived him as a great leader, but the fact that his closest associates, including Brutus, whom he considered his son, decided to kill him, made me realize how dangerous power is. This fact reminded me that even the greatest leaders can fall victim to intrigue and betrayal. It changed my perception of power and made me more skeptical of those who have it, realizing that there could always be dark things going on behind the scenes. Answer 15. It was a shock to me to learn about mass sterilizations carried out in the United States in the 20th century as part of the eugenics program. Thousands of people deemed unfit to reproduce due to mental or physical disabilities were sterilized without their consent. I've always considered the U.S. a symbol of freedom and human rights, but this fact showed me how easily human rights can be violated under the guise of pseudoscience. This story made me think about how important it is to protect the rights of every person, regardless of their health or social status. She also reminded me that science and progress without ethics can have dire consequences. Answer 16. One of the historical facts that shattered my understanding of the world is the history of the Cultural Revolution in China under the leadership of Mao Zedong. During this period, millions of people were persecuted, humiliated, imprisoned, or killed for being considered enemies of the people. What began as an attempt to eradicate bourgeois values turned into mass extermination and chaos. This story made me realize how easily ideology can become a tool of terror and destruction. I realized that even the most noble goals can lead to disastrous consequences if pursued without regard for human life and dignity. Answer 18. One of the facts that struck me to the core is the history of the Holocaust. Of course, I knew about World War II, but when I started going into details, such as how the Nazis systematically killed millions of people just because of their ethnicity or religion, it changed my perception of humanity. I was especially shocked by the story of how the Nazis used Jewish children as test subjects for medical experiments. It reminded me that human cruelty knows no bounds, and that even in the most developed and civilized countries, such horrors can occur. Answer 19. The story of Australia's colonization and treatment of the Aborigines completely changed my views on world history. I learned that the British colonialists not only took land from indigenous peoples, but also destroyed entire tribes, took children away from their parents, and tried to eradicate their culture. This discovery shattered my illusions that colonization was a civilizing process. I now understand that this was one of the most brutal forms of oppression and genocide, and that many peoples are still suffering from the consequences of these actions. Answer 20. It was a huge shock for me to learn about the events in Rwanda in 1994. In 100 days, about 800,000 people, mostly ethnic Tutsis, were killed in the country. I grew up thinking that such massacres were a thing of the past, but this fact showed that even in the late 20th century, humanity is capable of such atrocities. What struck me most was how the international community failed to act despite what was happening. It destroyed my idea that there are always forces in the world ready to stand up for the oppressed. Answer 21. The story of Zanzibar slavery was a real revelation for me. I learned that until the end of the 19th century, there was a huge slave market in Zanzibar, which served not only Arab slave traders, but also Europeans who came for labor. I was shocked by the fact that many of these slaves were torn from their families and never saw their loved ones again. This story made me reconsider my views on colonialism and its consequences, reminding me that European powers did not always bring civilization to other parts of the world. Answer 22. When I learned about the Dutch Holodomor, the Dutch famine of 1944 to 1945, it came as a shock to me. More than 20,000 people died of starvation in a country that in my mind has always been associated with prosperity and culture. It turned out that this was the result of deliberate actions by the Nazis, who blocked the delivery of food to regions resisting occupation. This fact reminded me that even in developed countries, catastrophic events can occur and that no one is immune from the horrors of war. Answer 23. It was a shock to me to discover that the United States used the tactics of burning villages and massacres of civilians during the Vietnam War. Operation Phoenix and the use of napalm are things I've never even heard of before. I've always believed that America, despite its mistakes, strives to protect democratic values, but this fact showed that there is no place for morality in war, and even the most bright countries can commit terrible crimes. It changed my perception of foreign policy and made me think about the cost of achieving political goals. Answer 24. The story of the Opium Wars between Britain and China in the 19th century completely changed my perception of Western civilization. I learned that the British government was actively involved in the drug trade to compensate for the trade deficit with China by forcing the Chinese to consume opium. This led to mass dependency, social destruction, and wars that resulted in China losing much of its territory and sovereignty. This fact showed me that even the most highly cultural countries can act solely for selfish reasons, without regard for the consequences for other peoples. Answer 25. When I learned about massacre in Nanjing, it was one of the most terrible discoveries of my life. I have always considered Japan to be a highly developed and cultured country, but this story showed me what even the most civilized nations are capable of. In 1937, the Japanese army killed hundreds of thousands of Chinese, including women and children, and committed mass rape. This fact made me think that cruelty knows no bounds, and that no one is immune from such tragedies if hatred and militancy are allowed to take over. Answer 26. The story of the triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas left a deep wound in my soul. I knew about slavery, but the scale and systematic nature of it shocked me. Millions of Africans were torn from their homes, sold into slavery, and transported across the Atlantic in horrendous conditions. I was amazed that European countries, which are today considered bastions of democracy and human rights, were so actively involved in this barbaric business. It made me look at history differently and realize that much of today's wealth was built on suffering and blood. Answer 27. When I learned about the history of medical experiments on prisoners in concentration camps in Nazi Germany, it changed my worldview. I always believed that science serves progress and humanity, but the fact that doctors and scientists were conducting horrific experiments on people, using them as guinea pigs, destroyed my illusions. These people, deprived of all rights, were subjected to monstrous torture in the interests of science. This fact made me think more deeply about how important it is to maintain ethical standards in science so as not to repeat such horrors in the future. Answer 28. The history of Tula chemical weapons, which were used by the USSR against its own people in the 1920s, became a real revelation for me. I learned that during the suppression of peasant uprisings, the government used poisonous gases to kill people en masse. This fact was kept silent for many decades and only recently began to receive due attention. It opened my eyes to how oppressive and cruel a government can be when it comes to maintaining its power. This fact destroyed my trust in government agencies and forced me to reconsider my views on the history of my country. Answer 29. When I learned about the MK-Ultra project, it shattered all my ideas about how far governments could go in their experiments on people. Project MK-Ultra was a secret CIA program that began in the 1950s and involved conducting cruel and unethical experiments on people to control their minds. I was amazed that these experiments used LSD, hypnosis, and other methods of mental influence, often without the consent or knowledge of the participants. Reading about it was like being plunged into a nightmare. Some people on whom these experiments were carried out were simply destroyed. Their lives were destroyed due to the fact that their consciousness was subjected to cruel manipulation. The most terrifying thing for me was the realization that these experiments were carried out at a time when the American government was publicly condemning the USSR for violating human rights. This fact made me reconsider all my beliefs that the government truly cares about the welfare of its citizens. He also reminded me that what we see on the surface is not always the truth, and that there may be things going on behind the scenes that we don't even want to know about. Answer 30. The story that really shook me was the British colonial rule in India, especially the events surrounding the Bengal famine of 1943. I always thought that colonialism was certainly brutal, but I did not realize its true extent and consequences. During the Bengal famine, which was caused not so much by natural causes as by incorrect policies and economic exploitation of the region by the British administration, about 3 million people died. I was shocked to learn that the British government had not only ignored the scale of the disaster, but was also actively preventing food supplies from reaching the region. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, whom I always considered a hero of the Second World War, was openly dismissive of the suffering of millions of people, declaring that the Indians are to blame and that, if they die, it is their own fault. This discovery completely shattered my illusions about the heroism and nobility of Western leaders and made me think that history, as it is presented in textbooks, is often one-sided. I realized that it is important not just to believe in generally known facts, but to seek the truth, even if it is unpleasant. Answer 31. It was a huge shock to me to discover the facts surrounding the sterilization program in the United States in the first half of the 20th century. I always thought the U.S. was a pioneer in human rights, but to learn that thousands of people deemed unfit for reproduction were forcibly sterilized without their consent was a real shock to me. This practice, called eugenics, was intended to cleanse the nation of those considered inferior. I was shocked that among these people there were not only criminals, but also simply the poor, the mentally ill, and even those who did not meet certain social standards. The worst thing is that these programs were approved and supported at the highest level, right up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which in 1927 declared sterilization constitutional. This story made me reconsider my views on how easily basic human rights can be violated under the guise of pseudoscientific and social theories. This fact made me realize that even in a country that positions itself as a bastion of freedom and human rights, there can be systematic violations of these rights that are rarely talked about. I began to think more about how often history hides dark pages, and how important it is to remember these mistakes so that they do not repeat themselves in the future. Answer 32. The story of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became one of the most painful and difficult for me to understand. I always knew that World War II was a terrible event, but when I dug into the details and learned exactly how those bombs affected people, it shattered my entire understanding of humanity. The bombs killed hundreds of thousands of people, not only instantly, but also years after the explosion due to radiation. People who survived the explosion suffered from illness, deformities, and psychological trauma. For me, the most shocking fact was the realization that these bombs were dropped not so much for military necessity, but as a show of force. I read that many military experts at the time believed that Japan was ready to surrender without using nuclear weapons. But the decision to bomb was made to show the Soviet Union the power of the new weapon. This realization made me think about how often political and military decisions are made without regard for human life and morality. This story also made me think about the consequences of progress. I realized that science and technology, which should benefit humanity, can become weapons of mass destruction if they fall into the wrong hands. This fact shattered my belief that progress always leads to better things, and made me more critical of any statements about the necessity of certain actions to achieve political or military goals. Answer 33. For me, a real shock was the discovery of facts about the genocide of the indigenous peoples of America. I knew that Native Americans suffered from colonization, but I never understood the extent of this disaster until I began to study the issue further. I learned that millions of indigenous people were killed through a combination of war, forced displacement, and the deliberate spread of disease. I was especially struck by the discovery that the American government deliberately distributed blankets contaminated with smallpox among the tribes in order to reduce their numbers. This story made me realize how cruel and cynical politics can be when it comes to conquering land and resources. It struck me that these actions were deliberately planned and carried out to open up land for European settlers. It destroyed my belief that the history of the American nation was founded on the principles of freedom and justice. I began to think more about the fact that many of the achievements of civilization were achieved at the cost of heinous crimes against humanity. This fact also made me rethink my views on patriotism and national pride. I realized that the history of any nation is complex and multi-layered, and that behind the brilliant achievements, there can be dark and painful pages. I now understand how important it is to acknowledge and study these facts in order to understand the true face of history and learn from the mistakes of the past. Answer 34. The story of Ankara and how Turkey treated the Kurds changed my perception of nationalism and human rights. I have always considered Turkey to be a modern and progressive state, but when I learned that the Turkish government was pursuing a systematic policy of oppressing the Kurdish people, I was shocked. The Kurds are the largest ethnic group in Turkey without a state and have been subject to decades of discrimination, bans on their language and culture, and forced deportations. I was particularly shocked by the story of how the Turkish government forcibly moved entire villages to sever the connection between the Kurdish people and their land. These actions reminded me of how dangerous nationalism can be when it becomes a tool for oppressing other peoples. I realized that even in modern countries that claim to be democratic and progressive, horrific human rights violations can occur. This story made me think that freedom and human rights are something that must be constantly fought for. They are not given once and for all, and even in countries that seem stable, systematic violations of these rights can occur. I now appreciate the freedoms I have more and realize that it is important to protect the rights of all peoples, regardless of their ethnicity or religion. Answer 35. The history of the Holocaust is, of course, familiar to many, but for me it was a discovery how indifferent and even complicit the world community was towards these events. I was shocked to learn that many countries, including the US and UK, knew what happened in the death camps, but deliberately chose not to intervene or minimize the tragedy in their communications to the public. Even more shocking to me was the fact that even after the end of the war, many of those responsible for these crimes escaped punishment or received symbolic sentences. It was a shock to learn that after the Nuremberg trials, many Nazi criminals simply disappeared into society or were hired by governments and large corporations. It made me think about how hypocritical international politics can be and how often victims are left without justice. This fact completely changed my perception of the post-war world. I realized that the history of justice is not always linear and fair. Many criminals escape accountability and their victims remain forgotten. It made me think more deeply about how important it is to remember these tragedies and seek justice for those who suffered. Answer 36. One of the most devastating historical facts for me was discovering how African American communities were systematically suppressed and destroyed in the United States in the 20th century. I was especially struck by the history of the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, where in 1921 one of the bloodiest racial clashes in U.S. history took place, known as the Tulsa Race Pogrom. White residents of the city, supported by local authorities, attacked the thriving black community known as Black Wall Street, killing hundreds of people and destroying their homes and businesses. I was amazed not only that this massacre happened, but also how long it was kept quiet. It wasn't taught in schools, it was ignored in official histories, and only recently has it begun to receive the attention it deserves. I was shocked to learn that such acts of violence were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic pattern of racial discrimination and violence against African Americans for many decades. This fact made me realize how deeply rooted racial prejudice is in society and how long history can ignore or hide crimes against humanity. I realized that the fight for equality and justice is not just a historical fact, but an ongoing process that requires awareness and action. This discovery changed my perception of modern America and made me think about the importance of fighting injustice in any form. Answer 37. The story that really shocked me was the MAO's activities in China, especially during the Great Leap Forward. I knew China had gone through difficult times, but I never realized how devastating that period was for millions of people. During the Great Leap Forward, when Mao Zedong decided to accelerate the industrialization of the country, millions of people were forced to work on collective farms and government projects. This led to a catastrophic famine that killed an estimated 15 to 45 million people. What struck me was that despite the obvious signs of impending disaster, the Chinese government continued with policies that only made the crisis worse. People were dying of hunger on a massive scale, and the authorities preferred to ignore this fact, hiding it from the world community. I was shocked to learn that during this time, propaganda portrayed China as a country moving towards a bright future, while millions of people were suffering and dying in terrible conditions. This story made me realize how far governments can go in their quest for power and control, and how often these quests lead to disastrous consequences for ordinary people. I realized that political decisions made at the highest levels can have dire consequences if they do not take into account the real needs and suffering of people. This realization changed the way I think about politics and power, making me think about the importance of monitoring and critically evaluating the actions of decision-makers. Answer 38. The story that completely changed my perception of world politics was the crisis and collapse of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. I always believed that after World War II, Europe learned to avoid war and conflict, but this crisis showed me how fragile peace can be, even in the most stable regions. The Yugoslav wars saw numerous ethnic cleansings, massacres, rapes, and other horrors that I could not have imagined at the end of the 20th century. I was particularly shocked by the way the international community responded to this conflict. Despite obvious signs of impending disaster, world leaders for a long time preferred not to intervene, hoping that the conflict would resolve itself. As a result, tens of thousands of people died, millions were forced to flee their homes, and entire cities were destroyed. The most shocking thing for me was the discovery that even after the world saw photographs and videos of the horrors taking place in Srebrenica and other places, the international community still continued to act slowly and hesitantly. This made me realize that for all the talk about protecting human rights and preventing genocides, in reality, international politics is often determined not by ethical principles, but by geopolitical interests. This story shattered my belief that there are always forces in the world ready to protect the innocent and prevent tragedies. I realized that the world is much more complex and tougher than I imagined, and that every person must be ready to fight for justice and peace without relying on outside help. Answer 39. The story that deeply shocked me is related to the activities of Leopold II in the Congo. I always knew that colonialism was cruel and unjust, but I never realized how far people could go in their quest for power and wealth. Leopold II, King of Belgium, ruled the Congo as his personal property, turning the country into a giant plantation where millions of people were turned into slaves. They were forced to work in terrible conditions to collect rubber and other resources, and those who did not meet the quota were subject to harsh punishments, including the amputation of limbs. I was particularly struck by the fact that, according to various estimates, between 10 and 15 million Congolese died as a result of this brutal policy. It was one of the most horrific acts of mass murder in history, which, however, remained virtually unknown in the world community for a long time. Leopold II managed to create the impression that his activities in the Congo were a mission of civilization, and many Europeans considered him a hero. This story made me realize how easily public opinion can be manipulated and how often history hides its darkest pages. I realized that it is important not to simply accept what people say about heroes and leaders, but to seek the truth, even if it is inconvenient. This story shattered my illusions about the civilization of Europe and made me think about how many more similar tragedies are hidden in world history. Answer 40. The story that truly changed my perception of the modern world was the refugee crisis and how countries in Europe and the United States responded to it. I've always believed that developed countries are willing to help those in need of protection and shelter, but the refugee crisis that began in 2015 showed me how cynical and cruel world politics can be. I was particularly shocked that thousands of people fleeing war and violence in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and other countries faced brutal resistance on Europe's borders. Many countries have closed their borders or imposed severe restrictions, leaving tens of thousands of people trapped at their borders without access to basic living conditions. Some of them died trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea or on the borders of Eastern Europe. This fact made me realize how hypocritical international politics can be. Countries that pride themselves on their humanitarian values and human rights are willing to ignore the suffering of millions of people for the sake of their own political and economic interests. I realize that there is no place in the world for simple divisions into good and evil. and that even those who claim to be defenders of human rights can act only from selfish motives. This story made me think about how important it is not only to talk about human rights, but also to act in accordance with these principles. I realize that each of us has a role to play in helping those who need protection, and that it is important to be sensitive to the suffering of others no matter where it occurs.